Good afternoon, everybody. I am Asaf Romarowski, the Executive Director of Zmio, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to yet another session, our webinar sessions of our Zmio webinar talks. This afternoon, we have the privilege and pleasure of hosting Bunty Churchill. Bunty was the partner of the late founder of the association, Professor Bernard Lewis, and will be sharing with us this afternoon memoirs and personal reflections about their life together and about their companionship. And so we are privileged to have her talk about Lewis and giving the personal take on Lewis's personal life, as well as his public appearances and everything else that goes around that. Those of you who have not know much about the association, Bernard Lewis was one of the co-founders of the association, together with Professor Fouad Ajami, and we, as Zmio, have continue to maintain his legacy and work hard to share stories about Professor Lewis and his work, scholarly and publicly, as far as the work that he's done over the years. So it's really a great opportunity for us to host Bunty in this venue. Format-wise, for those of you who've been with us in the past, know Bunty will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll go into a Q&A. We will do our best to get to all the questions once Bunty is done. If we don't get to your questions this afternoon, you can always feel free to email us after the talk itself. The talk itself will be recorded, and you'll be able to also view it later on if you do not have time, or if you want to pass it on to other viewers who are interested in today's webinar. So really, without further ado, Bunty, thank you for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. Bernard Lewis and I met in 1989 at a reception before a meeting of the Philadelphia Committee on Foreign Relations. We talked and laughed and proceeded to have lunch every couple of months and became friends. Many of our interests coincided: playing with the English language, puns, and of course the Middle East. I had done my graduate work at Penn on Egypt and Nasser, and his available work at that time was on Turkey and the medieval Islamic period. I hate to admit it, but at that point, I didn't know who Bernard Lewis was. Our friendship developed in new and undreamt of ways, and as it says on page 284 of his memoir, he never expected at the age of 80 to fall in love. He waited a year and a half after my husband died of a heart attack in 1994 before making his move. A charming English gentleman, Bernard Lewis was the master of 4 civilizations: Western, Classical, Islamic, and Jewish, and he was the preeminent historian of the Middle East for over 60 years. Translated into 29 languages, his books on the Middle East, Islam, Jewry, and general history have shaped generations of scholars. He was also the master of 15 languages. His English was flawless, and he was fluent in French, German, Yiddish, Italian, Danish, Turkish, Hebrew, Farsi, Arabic, and he could manage Norwegian, Russian, and Spanish, in addition, of course, to Latin and Greek. Bernard insisted on understanding foreigners in their own languages and always understood that our frame of reference, our identities, the superstructure of our thought, hinge on words and how they radiate within us. He had an impish sense of humor and was a superb raconteur. One example, in a discussion of heraldry and heraldic animals, for Russia it's the bear, for England the lion, for the US the eagle, when asked what was the animal for the Middle East, he immediately answered the sandfly. Sometimes it was irony. During his travel in Arab countries, he heard again and again the Arab line of argument: we have time, we have patience, history is on our side. We got rid of the Crusaders, we got rid of the Turks, we got rid of the British, and we'll get rid of the Jews in due course. Finally, he had heard this once too often, and sitting with friends in Jordan, he said, "Excuse me, but you've got it wrong." They said, "What do you mean we've got it wrong? That's what happened." And Bernard said, "Not quite. The Turks got rid of the Crusaders. The British got rid of the Turks. The Jews got rid of the British. I wonder who's coming here next." Bernard was masterful with English, was beloved by his students, was incomparably well-traveled, and was welcomed among global leaders. The academic world honored him with 15 honorary doctorates. The president of the prestigious Council on Foreign Relations described him as the master of the Middle East universe. The Wall Street Journal called him the world's foremost Islamic scholar. The New York Times said he was the doyen of Middle East studies. The most influential Arab newspaper, Cairo's Al Ahram, wrote, Bernard Lewis has no rival in his field. Bernard particularly liked the fact that in 1965, an Arab translation of the Middle East and the West was published under the auspices of the Muslim Brothers. The translator's introduction included the comment, "It's clear the author is one of two things, either a candid friend or an honorable enemy. And in either case, he is one who disdains to distort the truth." It's interesting that a book published under the auspices of the Muslim Brothers was published at the same time under the auspices of the Israel Defense Forces. Bernard was born in 1916, and he was always grateful to his mother for giving birth to him at her mother's home in London, rather than in the town where his parents actually lived. In England, no one asks, "Where were you born?" But in America, you're asked all the time in all sorts of situations. If he had to reply to that question with the name of the town where his parents lived, his reply would have been greeted with ridicule or embarrassed laughter. They lived in Maidenhead. When it was time for him to go to university in 1933, his father was adamant that he not go to Oxford or Cambridge, which he thought were party schools. So Bernard enrolled in SOAS, the School for Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. As a student of the Middle East, Bernard's interests were primarily historical rather than, as with most of his teachers and contemporaries, philological and literary. The first and most rudimentary test of a historian's competence is that he should be able to read his sources. This is not always easy, as for example, when the language is classical Arabic, or the writing is a crabbed Ottoman bureaucratic script. And that's not all. The historian of a region, of a period, or of a group of people must know something of its cultural context. And for that, literature is an indispensable guide. During his undergraduate years, he had an encounter of some linguistic significance with a particularly attractive young lady named Ada, the daughter of an exiled former Soviet commissar. Her family saw Yiddish as the authentic language of the Jewish common people. And thanks to her insistence and tutelage, Bernard learned Yiddish. And for the rest of his life, he was grateful to her, as he not only understood the punchline of Jewish jokes, he could make jokes in Yiddish. One example, we were discussing animal males and females, a bull and a cow, a rooster and a hen, and I asked, "What's the female of a rabbit?" And he immediately answered, "A rebbitzin." For those of you who may not have Yiddish, a rebbitzin is the rabbi's wife. Bernard particularly loved poetry, and his book, Music of a Distant Drum, is a collection of his translations of medieval Turkish, Hebrew, Arabic, and Persian poems. And one of my favorites is by the 11th century poet, Yehuda Halevi. "One gray hair appeared on my head. I plucked it out with my hand. It answered me, 'You have prevailed against me alone, but what will you do when my army comes after me?'" In 1936, he took his final examination for a BA in history at the University of London with more than 100 others. And when the list of graduates was published, he not only had first-class honors in Middle East history, but he was the first among the small number who had first-class honors in all the branches of history. His father was stunned. He was convinced that Bernard would do poorly as he thought Bernard had been spending much too much time with his girlfriend. And getting that first of first was a delicious moment for him. The prize of £100 enabled him to go to Paris to do graduate work with Louis Massignon, the great French Islamic scholar. Massignon was a moody man who reacted to Bernard in different ways on different days. And Massignon had two prejudices based on two aspects of Bernard's identity. Sometimes Bernard was not quite sure what his offense was. Was it crucifying Jesus as a Jew or burning Joan of Arc as an Englishman? Fortunately, Paris had much to offer beside Massignon. In 1940, Bernard joined the British Army and was given a form to fill out. And one line said, race. This was the first time he had ever encountered race on an official document, and he didn't know what they wanted. If he had been joining the German army, he sure as heck would have known what they wanted, but he was joining the British Army. He asked the sergeant in charge to explain what race meant, and the sergeant gave him that sort of pitying look that sergeants had for new recruits. And the sergeant tried to explain, but was unsuccessful. So Bernard asked, well, am I supposed to put Jewish here? No, said the sergeant, that's your religion. They don't ask two different questions to get the same answer. This is for your race. So Bernard said, well, what? And nowadays one would say white or Caucasian, but that wouldn't have entered his mind then. White was a color or a lack of one, and Caucasian meant people from the Caucasus. So the sergeant explained slowly and carefully that as far as the British Army was concerned, there were 4 races, and Bernard had to choose from among the 4: English, Scottish, Welsh, or Irish. 1940 is essential to understanding what drove Bernard Lewis: the year of Dunkirk and the fall of France, the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, the year of blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and their finest hour, and a year when Britain fought alone. The spirit of 1940 had a sense of national unity and purpose, which was unprecedented and will probably never be revived. Lewis was already 23 years old and was regarded as a prodigy, if not a genius. And one of the last things he did before his mobilization was to hurry his doctoral thesis into print. He didn't regard it as a finished product, but he published it anyway. He was going to war and didn't know what fate had in store. Bernard was always reticent when it came to the details of his 4 years of service. He was initially assigned to a tank regiment, but because of his ineptitude with tanks or his aptitude with languages, he was transferred. He spent some time at Bletchley Park helping to break codes, and in 1941, he moved over to MI6, Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service. He took his signing of the Official Secrets Act very seriously, and to the end of his life would not talk about exactly what he had done. He would only say that much of the time it was a desk job, and he translated documents, mostly from Arabic. In 1943, his employers came into possession of some documents in a language they believed to be Turkish. The documents were passed to Bernard for translation and analysis. He didn't know what language it was, but he thought it was Albanian, and the clue was it mentioned Tirana, the Albanian capital. The higher-ups reasoned that since Albania is close to Turkey, and as Bernard knew Turkish, he could learn Albanian quickly. He was willing to try, but in the words of the great leader, give us the tools and we will finish the job. And the tools he needed were an Albanian grammar and an Albanian dictionary. They hunted around and they found both. The grammar was in German, published in 1913. It was a grammar of the South Geg dialect of the Albanian, and he had ascertained in the meantime that Albanian came in 3 main dialects: Geg, Tusk, and Yap. and this was Geg, and not just Geg, but South Geg. The dictionary is a volume 1, A to M, of an Albanian Serbo-Croat dictionary. He had no Serbo-Croat, but he had a colleague who was a Balkan specialist. The first thing he did was go through the grammar rapidly and confirm that the documents were indeed in Albanian, and words beginning with letters M to Z, or as he would say, M to Z, he simply abandoned. Words beginning with the letters A to M, he looked up in the Albanian Serbo-Croat dictionary and telephoned the Balkan expert to ask, what does blank mean? And the expert asked if there were a chevron, in French, a circumflex, on the third Z. Bernard confirmed that there was. And the expert said, according to the context, it meant yesterday afternoon or bellyache. Bernard continued through the documents and came to the conclusion that what one of His Majesty's less official representatives had, shall we say, purloined, was the business correspondence of an Albanian carpet merchant. And what made this discovery easy was that the Albanian word for carpet is the same as the Turkish word, and various carpets were referred to by name, Shiraz, Bukhara, and so forth. And Bernard reported accordingly. His employers were obviously disappointed, and one of them asked, couldn't this be some sort of a disguise, a sort of code for something else? And at that point, Bernard protested. Anything less likely than that the German High Command was carrying on its operations disguised as carpet talk in South Geg would be difficult to imagine. The matter was dropped. Many years later, Bernard was introduced to an Albanian ambassador at a reception, and he couldn't resist asking him if he were Geg. And without batting an eyelid, the man replied that he was Geg. And then Bernard couldn't help himself and asked, South Geg? The ambassador gave him a very strange look. One of Bernard's great regrets was that when Churchill visited his unit, he was on leave, and he would have been the one to escort him around. He never met Churchill, but on one occasion he was received by the legendary C, Sir Stuart Menzies, the head of MI6, the Secret Service. Bernard could no longer remember what they talked about, but he would say, even if I could, I wouldn't be allowed to repeat it. As you can imagine, when the war ended, there were a large number of people eager to leave their war service and start their university study. There was an urgency to release university teachers, of which Bernard was one, from duty so that they could resume their university positions. In fact, he was the first professional teacher of Middle Eastern history anywhere in England, the first to study, write, and teach Arab history. He was a professor of the University of London School of African, Oriental, and African Studies for 25 years. He had a good life in London. He was an admired and respected professor. He was on the embassy circuit. He was an officer in the British Academy. And when, in due course, he moved up to the presidency, he would have been knighted. But he had been through a bitter divorce and wanted a new life. And he came to Princeton at age 58 with dual appointments, which had never been done before and has never been done since. He was a professor of Near East Studies at Princeton University, and he was appointed a member of the Institute for Advanced Study. He was steadfast in his support of his students. Despite his, by then, high reputation, he devoted much time to mentoring, and students felt privileged to work with him. Unusual for someone of his era, he was very supportive of his female students, and they considered themselves most fortunate to be able to work with him. He was as generous in his acknowledgments of his students' work as he was in his letters of recommendation. Many of his Middle Eastern students ended up in key spots in their countries, and when he traveled the region, he had access to those in the know. Princeton University had compulsory retirement at age 70. And at his retirement party, Charles Asawi toasted him by saying that, to Bernard, retirement meant a new set of tires and full speed ahead. He's written a total of 32 books, 13 of them after his retirement. The 32 include The Arabs in History, The Emergence of Modern Turkey, still in print after 60 years, The Muslim Discovery of Europe, The Assassins, Semites and Anti-Semites, Race and Slavery in the Middle East, The Multiple Identities of the Middle East, and the two which I co-authored with him, Islam, the Religion and the People, which was a primer that was needed right after 9/11, and his memoir, Notes on a Century. The inordinate amount of wealth, the wealth of scholarship that Lewis produced in well over half a century of academic life has enriched the field as no other. His astute and learned analyses were not offered as predictions, but they were amazingly prescient in their understanding of the social and political undercurrents of the Arab world. When Bernard's trailblazing article, The Return to Islam, appeared in Commentary magazine in 1976, the preposterous notion that Islamists might one day seize the Grand Mosque in Mecca, overthrow the monarchy in Iran, assassinate Anwar Sadat, kill 241 US Marines in their barracks in Beirut, fly planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and reestablish a caliphate ruling over an Islamic state in Syria and Iraq would have seemed outlandish in a novel. In fact, nothing of what we regard today as the infrastructure of Islamism was visible at all. So how did Bernard discern the return of Islam? From the 1970s onward, he would later write, to anyone following events in the Muslim world and reading or listening to what Muslims were saying in their own languages, the surge in religious passion was increasingly obvious. In fact, Bernard was just about the only one to whom it was obvious. Even his rivals acknowledged Bernard Lewis's intellectual power. The late leftist anti-Israel Columbia University professor of literature, Edward Said, built much of his theory of Orientalism as an attack on Bernard. Said's view is that Western analysts, the Orientalists, write about Middle East cultures as a rationalization for the West's exploitation of them. To think, as he did, that only Muslims can delve into Islam and only they can understand the Middle East is nonsensical. A Swede looking at Swedish history evaluates it one way, and a non-Swede just looks at it through a different prism. Both are valuable and valid. Who would dare say that Columbia professor of English literature, Edward Said, and others of Middle Eastern descent have no business teaching any subject other than Islam or something related to the Middle East? Bernard trounced this idea perfectly in a question and answer period after he delivered a lecture at UCLA. A student asked, "How can you, a white, Jewish Englishman, really understand Islam in the Middle East?" Bernard thoughtfully replied, "At this university, you have a world-renowned Department of Oceanography, and I have to assume it's not manned by a faculty of fish." Said is spelled S-A-I-D, and one of the best articles I came across about him, written by David Price Jones, was entitled, "Enough Said." In 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and in January 1991, a coalition of 91 countries stopped Saddam and liberated Kuwait, with a ground campaign lasting only 100 hours. When Bernard heard this, he exclaimed, "It shouldn't have been called the Gulf War. It should have been called Coitus Interruptus." Through some of the anecdotes I've told you, you get a whiff of Bernard's sense of humor. And when Bernard reached the age of 90, he commented that he'd finally reached his anecdotage. In the Atlantic Monthly, Lewis wrote on the roots of Muslim rage, discussing not just the rise of Islam, but the rage and the fury of a civilization in retreat and its potential for vengeful violence against the West. The United States had inherited the resulting grievances and had become the focus for the then pent-up anger and hate. This 1990 article was an ominous warning, 10 years between 2001. And by the time the Twin Towers came down on 9/11, no one had done as much to flag the danger as Bernard Lewis. Over the course of his life, he watched the world of Islam shift from the realm of musty archives to the evening news, and he helped make that happen. In 1998, an Arabic newspaper in London published a declaration of jihad written by Osama bin Laden. Bernard translated it and published it in Foreign Affairs under the title License to Kill. He also found a key piece in Farsi by Ayatollah Khomeini and was the first to translate it and have it published. He introduced these figures to the English-speaking world. Samuel Huntington in 1996 published his acclaimed book, The Clash of Civilizations. He credited Bernard with the first use of the phrase coined in the early 50s to describe the history of conflict between Islam and Christendom. But Bernard was uncomfortable with the way Huntington generalized his turn of phrase, and he described Huntington's thesis as too harsh. And in a revision of his book, The Shaping of the Modern Middle East, he replaced clash between civilizations with encounter. Bernard did believe in a perpetual clash, not, however, between civilizations, but between freedom and tyranny. By the way, Martin Kramer gave an excellent talk on the Clash of Civilizations for ESMIA about a year ago. Then came September 11th, 2001. By chance, by luck, by serendipity, the attacks coincided with the publication of Bernard's What Went Wrong, explaining why Western civilization ascended and Islamic civilization descended, followed a year later by The Crisis of Islam. Americans wanted to know who these terrorists were, and they bought these books. They also read the prize-winning Revolt of Islam in the New Yorker 2 months after 9/11. 2 years later, in April 2003, shortly before his 87th birthday, he had two simultaneous bestsellers on the New York Times nonfiction lists. Crisis of Islam was #1 in hardcover, and What Went Wrong, #1 in paperback. Osama bin Laden made me famous, Bernard Riley noted, and went on to say, I was interviewed, quoted, filmed, and I even made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And I can remember remarking at the time that if bin Laden claimed a percentage of my royalties, I would have had to admit there was some justice in his claim. With these books, Bernard became a public personage, the expert on Islam. And one of my favorite quotes about him was, Lewis had the intellectual courage to navigate the third rail of relations between the West and Islam. Contrary to much of what has been written, Lewis wasn't particularly a political person. He was, however, a proud patriot of both America and Britain. Having been a member of MI6 during World War II, he understood that scholars could serve their country without diminishing their intellectual probity. This disposition is foreign to many younger scholars who have been raised to suspect all associations between intellectuals and government. Lewis's patriotism had him believe it is a commendable imperative that if democratically elected representatives ask for their opinion, scholars should have the decency to give it. And this led him occasionally to Washington to see bureaucrats, congressmen, and presidents. Lewis unfailingly understood that American soldiers, diplomats, and spies aren't trying to dominate, conquer, or exploit foreign societies when they do their utmost to penetrate them. They are endeavoring to learn how the natives think, what their priorities are, and how they perceive foreigners' intentions. Bernard had a relationship with Tel Aviv University, where pro bono, he lectured and taught for over 40 years. And to thank him for his service and the 18,000 volume library he donated, the university gave a dinner in his honor. A number of people, including Henry Kissinger, made flattering remarks. Now, Bernard and Kissinger would have lunch together several times a year. Kissinger commented that having lunch with Bernard was really special because with Bernard, he listened. For you to get a whiff of Bernard's erudition, charm, and wit, here he is thanking the American Friends of Tel Aviv University for honoring him.
I am deeply grateful to those of you who have spoken, to those of you who have listened, more particularly to those of you who have listened. And I very much appreciate your presence here and all that you have done for me. I would like to read you an excerpt from my memoirs, Notes of a Century, which seemed to me to be appropriate to this occasion. I modified slightly to bring it up to date. I am 96 years old. On walks now, I must use a cane or a walker. I need hearing aids. I take naps. I eat less and weigh more. My short-term memory is not what it used to be. Bunsey, the lady of my life, tells me that if I continue to degenerate, I will eventually become normal. I quote that as a witticism, but not with approval. Over the years, I must admit that I have deteriorated physically and even mentally, but not emotionally. I have lived a long life, and I have loved it for the most part. I have had an interesting and on the whole, a rewarding career. I have written many books of varying quality, which were translated into almost 30 languages, which isn't too bad. I have explored all sorts of places and countries and been able to play more or less with quite a large number of languages. You know, with languages, it also works on the principle of buy one, get one free. My late wife was Danish. We used to go to Denmark every winter, every summer, I should say. And I learned Danish fairly well. And I found that if I learn Danish, you know Norwegian and you can manage Swedish. So does that count as one language or three? I don't know. As I said, I have explored many places and cultures and been able to play with many languages. Even those, there are many who dislike me or who disagree with me or with whom I have disagreed, are generally interesting and sometimes even stimulating. And I'm grateful to them too. They're not as grateful as I am to my friends and admirers. I have a family and stalwart friends whom I cherish. There is a common Israeli phrase when offering birthday greetings to the elderly to say Ad Me'av Yisrim to 120. Sometimes nowadays, they modify it by changing one consonant, one Hebrew consonant, and say Ad Me'av Yisrim to 100 like 20, which I think on the whole is a more attractive proposition. I'm approaching that rapidly. I have been in my long life and remain very fortunate. I am particularly fortunate in the way that you have honored and accepted me this evening. And for that, I am deeply grateful.
As Bernard mentioned, I was the lady in his life for 22 years, and I want to share with you just a couple of my favorite memories. I was in a funk one evening after a tough day at the office and asked Bernard to help get me out of it, which he did by talking to me for about 20 minutes. And when we were hanging up, I thanked him for helping me out of the mire so delightfully. And he responded, I not only admire you, I demire you. Another special occasion was I once walked into his room as he was waking from a nap. And I asked if I could join him. And he said, oh, yes, please. There was only about 7 inches free on the edge of the mattress. So I carefully lay down on my side and proceeded to fall off the bed. One leg wrapped around his walker and the other ended up under his bed, and my hip ached. So I was very cautiously trying to get up. He peered at me over the edge of the bed and said, you've finally fallen for me. And the last one for this, we talked about marriage off and on, but we were content with our pattern. He had his life in Princeton and I in Philadelphia. And we would get together on the weekends, and we're always looking forward to a trip. I remember I went to his home and knocked on the door one Friday evening, and it was right before a holiday. And when he opened it, I said to him, Hag Sameach. And he said, I prefer Hag Sameach. So we talked about marriage off and on, but one time I asked him, if we were to get married, how would you kiss me under the chuppah? A British sedate one or a Hollywood passionate one? He gave me a long look and said, want to find out? On Bernard's 100th birthday, one of his former students wrote, Bernard Lewis has always seemed ageless as a scholar, teacher, editor, writer, and translator, and latterly as a sage. He has always been present, like the mountain peak one glimpses from a window, reassuringly solid, but various too, ever receptive to the changing light. And another student wrote, when you are in his presence, you know you are in the presence of a historical wonder. Through this talk, you've gathered what people thought of Bernard. What did he think of himself? While taking a walk one day in Tel Aviv on Ben Yehuda Street, an elderly man came running up to him and asked breathlessly, are you the great Bernard Lewis? And Bernard thought about this for a moment or two and replied, sometimes. His scholarship had an extraordinary range. He was thoroughly versed in the history and literature of Western civilization, and he combined that with a command of the totality of Islamic and Middle Eastern history from Muhammad in the 7th century to the present day. He was unmatched in his historical and linguistic erudition, but it's not merely a matter of erudition. Rather, it reflects an almost unparalleled ability to fit things together into a comprehensive synthesis. In this regard, it is hard to imagine that Bernard Lewis will have any true successors. These words are not only a tribute to him, but a tacit admission that at present, the field of Middle East and Islamic studies cannot attract or nurture a genius of his caliber. In his memoir, Notes on a Century, Bernard says, when I look back over the 10 decades of my life, I realize how extraordinarily fortunate I have been. I was a soldier in World War II, and I wasn't killed or even wounded. I was a Jew in 20th century Europe, and I wasn't murdered or even persecuted. I have lived in England and in the United States, that is, in countries that enjoy liberty, and I have always known that I may formulate my opinions as I choose, and that I may express them as I choose. The openness and freedom of Anglo-American society and the glorious anarchy of the English language were privileges which I took for granted until circumstances drew my attention to the absence of those freedoms elsewhere. Though Jewish and a staunch supporter of Israel, Lewis was also deeply sympathetic to Arabs who had to live under authoritarian rule. Although he will be remembered, favorably or otherwise, for many things, for one, he will never be forgotten. His all too accurate prognostication that our age would be defined by the return of Islam. Bernard was not only the first to alert the world to the possibility of Islamic upheavals, he demonstrated that they were not deviations at all, but a resumption of Islam's ancient feud with the West. In 2018, for the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the State of Israel, the embassy in Washington honored 70 Americans, Jewish and Christian, who were important to the state. The honorees included Harry Truman, Leonard Bernstein, Albert Einstein, Bayard Rustin, Elie Wiesel, and Frank Sinatra and Jimmy Hoffa, who helped deliver arms during the War of Independence. Bernard Lewis was on that list. He was too weak to attend the embassy reception to honor the 70, and I accepted the medal on his behalf. The next day, I put the medal around his neck, and he knew that Israel had honored him. He died 4 days later, 2 weeks before his 102nd birthday in May 2018. Afterwards, the university flag at Princeton flew at half-mast. At his funeral, a poem by Oliver Goldsmith was quoted. And still they gazed, and still the wonder grew that one small head could carry all he knew. He is buried in Tel Aviv, and his tombstone in English and in Hebrew reads simply, scholar, sage, mensch, beloved. A perfect summary of his life. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bunsey. Thank you for sharing all those reflections. And I obviously concur that probably there will never be another Bernard Lewis, and all of us here know that. And his legacy for sure lives on with you and with all of us who knew Lewis. And clearly, if you go to social media today, the amount of time that Lewis is still quoted all over the place is clearly a testament to his legacy and his impact all over. We have a lot of people who I think, on the line knew Lewis, and obviously we welcome now at this time any questions or reflections or comments that people may have about Lewis. We're happy to take them and share them at this time. Before we get to that, Alex, do you have a question? Maybe you want to start us off, and we'll start us off from there, maybe with the time we have left.
Sure. Well, so let me offer my thanks for a very informative and heartfelt and touching series of recollections about a unique individual who had a unique career. So my question really is, Lewis was an historian, a teacher, a writer. He was a public intellectual and informal political advisor. Which aspect of this multifaceted career did he find most gratifying? Can one be picked out?
By the way, can you see me? Because I have lost my video. And
Yeah, we can see you. You're good.
Oh, you can.
We can-
Okay, fine. That's a hard question to answer because he juggled them all so well. I mean, for example, when I was having dinner with him, I felt that I had his full attention. So that's hard to say. I think at different times, obviously, he was caught up in whatever was happening in the real world. But he also was devoted to his family. He was such a stalwart friend to some of the people he knew. I find that hard to answer. I'm sorry, I can't give you a better answer.
All good. I know that Alex, you have a follow-up, or should I think that Guido Remis has a question here. We can go to Guido.
No, let's move on, please.
All right, all good. Guido has a question. Let me see if I can unmute Guido and maybe he can ask it or type it. There we go. Go ahead, Guido, and ask your question.
It's not a question, really. It's a tribute.
Okay, all
Isabella
good.
Guillot and I really are indebted to Bernard Lewis for two things. One was the surprise we had when we published our first book as two journalists who are just making their first foray into academe, that he led a jury that awarded it a prize from ASMEA, from the Washington Institute, and later introduced us to ASMEA. And we discovered then, when we met, that he dealt with it without an ounce of condescension, endorsed it with some disagreement, but with appreciation. And this gave us an enormous boost, not only in terms of readership, but also in terms of our self-confidence in what we were doing. So that we will never forget. And the other thing, Bunsey, is getting to meet you.
Well, as you know, we've agreed to have coffee together when I'm next in Israel. So Lashana Haba Yerushalayim.
Amen.
Thank you, Guido. And we appreciate that. Suzanne, I see that we have a few questions in the chat, so why don't we go on to those?
Yes, we do. And obviously, to the best of your ability to answer these, Bunsey, would be much appreciated. The first question is from Carl Goldberg, and he writes, how do you explain that Bernard Lewis thought that Iraq could become a democratic country under American supervision?
I don't know.
Fair answer. Okay, so the next question that we have here is from Rich Joseph, and he writes, if Bernard was still with us today, what would he say about the current status quo in the Middle East and the United States?
Obviously, I am not going to put words into Bernard Lewis's mouth, but I'll tell you a funny story that's similar to that. There was a panel discussion on the Middle East at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and Kissinger was in the chair, and it was a boring event. And it came time for the Q&A. Kissinger said, we have in the audience two experts on the Middle East, Bernard Lewis and Fuad Ajami. Fuad, would you like to say something? And Fuad got up and said, if you think I'm going to speak before the great Bernard Lewis, no. And he sat down. So Kissinger said, Bernard, I think that was your cue. So Bernard got up and said something, and he sat down. And Kissinger said, Fuad, would you like to say something? He stood up and he said, if you think I'm going to say anything after the great Bernard Lewis, and he sat down. So, Rich, I am not about to put words into Bernard's mouth. That would be impossible.
True. Okay, so here we have what is described as a small contribution to this discussion by Aiden Karaloglu.
Oh, I have to say hello to Aidan Karaloglu, who was a very good friend of Bernard's.
She writes here, Professor Lewis was given the Ataturk Prize by the state of Turkey in 1998 by President Demirel. This prize has never been given to any other foreigner. So that was something that I did not know, but thank you for sharing that.
It was well deserved. And he was very fond of you, Aidan. I'd like to give one more anecdote, very brief.
Sure. I mean, why don't we do that? I'll let you, finish it, and then I'll sum it up. That'll be fine.
Okay. Bernard was once asked to speak at the Aspen Institute at some conference, and he was looking over the brochure with the bios of the speakers. And he said, mine is the shortest one. And I said, well, I guess it's because you probably only listed 1 or 2 or 3 of your books. He said, no, I listed none. And I said, well, that speaks volumes.
Yes, it does. Really, Bunty, I want to, take the opportunity to thank you for really all the heartfelt reflections about Lewis and sharing the stories about the man, the scholar, and your life together. I mean, clearly there will never be another Lewis, and his impact really is monumentous and will continue. I personally felt honored to know both you and Lewis over the years, and the fact that Professor Lewis actually knew who I was every time he saw me. So I really was always felt honored and privileged by that. So clearly there's a lot more to be discussed, and these stories are really, I think, a testament to his legacy all around, and to continue sharing them is something that I think is worthwhile doing. Here at ASMEA, we're trying to continue to follow his scholarship and to continue inspiring young and senior scholars to follow what Lewis and our other co-founder, Fuad Ajami, really laid down the path for all of us to follow. So I really want to thank you again for taking the time to share all your stories today, and for everybody who attended us today for coming and listening and hearing about Bernard Lewis.